Special shout out and a thank you to Chris Provencio of Textron Aviation for working on this program for months. He did a fantastic job. And we are joined again today by our resident astronaut and NBAA board member, Charlie Precourt, our master instructor and designated examiner, Mr. Neil Singer, and myself as the low bidder, as your moderator this morning. It's timely that our presentation this morning deals with the unstabilized approach. Many of us have just seen the NTSB final report on the Dale Earnhardt Jr. accident. And while we may ask, how in the world did that happen? Or it couldn't happen to me, it does happen to us. And we prepared a short video that illustrates just how quickly an unstable approach can develop. Let's take a look.
You know, in the space shuttle, we didn't have the option of going around, but you sure do. Unfortunately, we don't always make the right decisions when our approach becomes unstable. So let's take a look at a scenario that was developed from other accidents.
Citation 396, Delta Mike. Clear for the visual approach, Hilton Head. Change to advisory frequency approved, 118.975.
6 Delta Mike, thanks. Okay. And, okay, power to idle. Damn, speed brakes. Hilton Head, 396 Delta Mike is on a 3-mile final runway 21. Any traffic, please advise. Okay, speed brakes are out. I gotta slow this airplane down. We're coming down. We're heavy and we're fast. Okay, alright. Runway looks clear.
Sync rate.
Okay. Speed brakes out.
Sync rate.
Slow the airplane, slow down, come on.
Sync rate. Pull up. Pull up.
Slow down, airplane, come on.
Pull up.
Come on, airplane, slow down.
Pull up. 500. Pull up. Too low. Terrain.
Get out of gear. 3 green.
Too low. Terrain.
Okay, slow down.
Too low. Terrain.
Slow down, airplane. Slow down. Oh, okay, slow down. Alright. 396 Delta Mike, looks like we're gonna go off the end. Slow down. Oh, down. Slow down. Good grief.
Unfortunately, David was unable to recover the aircraft and it departed the runway. However, he and his passengers escaped without serious injury. His approach was unstable from the moment we saw him. The CJP SOPs say we should strive for a stabilized approach, and at 1,000 feet above field level if in IMC, or 500 feet above field level if in VMC, we should initiate a go-around if the approach does not meet all of our stabilized approach criteria. Let's look at some of those. For an approach to be considered stabilized, it should meet all of the following criteria. Landing gear down, flaps set as intended for landing, speed brakes retracted. Airspeed no less than 5 knots below VREF, no more than 20 knots above VREF. Descent rate no greater than 1,000 feet per minute. N1 stabilized at the appropriate setting for the descent. Horizontal and vertical guidance less than 1/2 scale deflection. Don't get caught in this scenario. The solution is simple. If unstable, go around.
It's great to learn from others. If you have an event you'd like to share, please send an email to safety@citationjetpilots.com. Thanks for watching and fly safe.
So that was pretty exciting, to say the least. The simulator makes those kind of experiences very real. And when I was actually running off at the end of the runway, I felt like I was running off the end of the runway. What we have next is a pre-recorded discussion with Charlie and Neil, where we go into a discussion about the unstabilized approach and the challenge that we have in a go-around. So let's play that. Welcome to the single pilot safety stand down from NBAA. I'm David Miller, Director of Safety Education for the CJP Safety Foundation. And with me today are Mr. Neil Singer, Master Instructor and Safety Consultant, and Mr. Charlie Astronaut Precourt, Chairman of the CJP Safety Committee. Welcome, guys.
Thank you, David.
So the title of our segment today is Excellence on the Approach. And if any case you just watched the video prior to this presentation, the video that you saw was anything but excellence on the approach. As a matter of fact, it was a recreation of an unstable approach and the effects that it had on that pilot, which happened to be me, and other pilots in the real world. So how do these things happen? How can we avoid them? How can we keep them from happening again? Neil, as a mentor pilot and a check airman, what are the factors involved here?
Sure. Well, of course, we want to prevent a approach from staying that bad all the way down to the runway. So a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the practices that we've created at CJP to tell a pilot when enough is enough. But before that, there are often chances to save a bad approach before it's too close to the runway. So let's look at a couple examples of that. So if we imagine a typical 3-degree path down to a runway, and a pilot has been maybe, as it happened in the video, cleared for a visual approach. It's actually where I see a lot of unstable approaches happen. The pilot finds themselves, let's say a 5, 6, 7 mile final, very high, okay, maybe fast as well is typically the case. The first mistake that a lot of pilots make is from wherever they are, even if they're high, they just fixate on making the descent angle down to the runway work. Of course, the problem with this is if that blue line represents a 3-degree path, if we fly that red line down to the runway, we're never stable. The entire approach, we're going to be, by definition, unstable because we've never achieved that 3-degree path that's important. So what we want to do, rather, is descend aggressively while you still can. So while you're still out 6, 7 miles and you have time to try to work on this approach, make the descent happen when you can and try to get to a point where you're stabilized a few miles out from the runway. So that's the first common setup that we see. Next one we see a lot is pilots realize that they are a little bit high, a little bit fast on the approach. And I see this all the time. The thrust levers go from here to here. And the pilot is putting the nose down, trying to descend, but they haven't brought the thrust levers all the way to idle. Now in the video, David actually did do this correctly and made a point of enunciating verbally that he was bringing the thrust levers to idle, but that's what we should do. Thrust is not your friend in this situation. If you're high and or fast, what that means fundamentally is that you have too much energy in the airplane. We have a combination of the aircraft's height and the aircraft's speed that represents our total energy. If our power is anything other than idle, then we are putting more energy into that system at a time when what we really want to be doing is taking it out. So certainly in a jet or turboprop, we want to be thinking about power to idle. And even in a piston airplane, a lot of pilots have a overblown, unscientific fear of shock cooling engines. We're not going to talk about shock cooling right now, but if you want to do a little research into it, look at skydiving airplanes that spend their whole life in either full power or idle power, consistently make it past TBO. So certainly it beats going off the end of the runway. Don't worry about that at that time. Third point I would make here is there are situations, and David's video is a great example, where counterintuitively, your best bet to try to become stabilized on an approach might be to level off for a short period of time so that you can get drag deployed. In the video, David spent most of his descent just slightly, 10 knots, maybe faster than the gear extension speed. So he wasn't able to extend his landing gear until, if I recall correctly, about 300 feet above the runway. If you put David in that exact same situation in terms of speed and height, and he pulled the power idle, deployed the speed brakes, and held the plane level just long enough to deploy the landing gear, he would have had a lot more drag in the system. Better yet, deploy the landing gear and then some flaps. Of course, ultimately, what we care about is our descent angle more than our descent rate. So if you can keep the same descent going, but now with your gear and your flaps down, you're doing that descent at 140 indicated knots instead of 210, as was the case in David's video, you're going to be descending at a steeper angle. So again, these are all strategies we only want to do when we are far enough from the runway that we can become safely stabilized. But ultimately, what we see in the accident history is that a lot of pilots don't deploy these strategies aggressively enough, so they end up maintaining an unstable descent all the way down to the runway and to touchdown.
So Neil, that was really good background discussion, especially about getting slowed down and maintaining the appropriate speed on the approach, unlike what I did in the video. I know that at CJP we've developed specific SOPs, we call them standard operating practices, that address a go-around. Can you talk about them and how we can use them?
Absolutely, David. So as you say, we have created standard operating practices. These are procedures we encourage our members to use, but it's available for download and use by any pilot, not just citation pilots, and really not just jet pilots. A lot of the procedures are applicable for any pilot. So the SOPs that relate to a stabilized approach say that we should always strive for a stabilized approach. And our current recommendations, and Charlie might talk a little bit more later about how this is a process in evolution, and it's something that we're constantly reevaluating. But right now, our recommendation is at 1,000 feet above the field, if in IMC, or 500 feet above the field, if in VMC, the pilot should initiate a go-around if the approach doesn't meet all of a list of criteria. So let's look at those criteria as they relate to this approach we just saw David fly. So the first criteria is that by 500 feet in VMC, which David's approach in the simulator looked to be in VMC, so let's use that. By 500 feet, the plane should be fully configured. Well, if we look back to that video, the plane was not fully configured. Here's David at just about 500 feet above field elevation, and the landing gear handle is still up. Airspeed should be within a range of no less than 5 knots below VREF, no more than 20 knots above VREF. This again represents the largest excursions that could be present at 500 feet and not call for a go-around. Well, 500 feet, David was flying well above 20 knots in excess of VREF, 215 knots indicated. So clearly that would call for a go-around. Descent rate, no greater than 1,000 feet per minute. Certainly exceeding that, 2,500 feet per minute. N1, the engine thrust stabilized at a setting appropriate for the descent rate. He did have the thrust at idle, which is not an appropriate setting. That is an indication, a warning to the pilot that the approach is not stabilized. And finally, the horizontal and vertical guidance should be less than half scale deflection. Now, David doesn't have an approach loaded here, so there is no horizontal or vertical guidance per se, but we can actually use the synthetic vision as a great stand-in for that. So if we blow up the synthetic vision on the center of David's attitude indicator, and I've just clarified the 5-degree pitch line and the aircraft symbol here because the picture is a little fuzzy blown up. But what we can see is where that runway symbol sits relative to that 5-degree line is a pretty good indication that the approach is pretty unstabilized. And that's because geometry just tells us that however far below the zero pitch line, in this case, let's say about 4.5 degrees, the runway threshold sits, that's the approach angle being flown. So if David was trying to fly a 3-degree visual approach, he was actually flying a 4.5-degree visual approach. That's well more than full-scale deflection, let alone half-scale deflection. So in this particular example that we filmed, every one of the 5 major criteria was not met. Any one of these criteria not being met is reason for a immediate go around passing through 500 feet. So again, those stabilized approach gates, we encourage people to think about passing through 1,000 feet in IMC, because if in IMC, the presumption is your workload is going to be a little bit higher. Of course, the aircraft energy state doesn't matter if it's IMC or VMC, but the pilot's bandwidth is going to probably be reduced in IMC. That's why we have a slightly more conservative recommendation. But by 500 feet in VMC, we should meet all of those criteria. So what we encourage pilots to think about is at 500 feet, it becomes a binary choice that from that point on, you have one of 2 choices. You either are keeping all of those major criteria inside those parameters, and then you can say stable, continuing. Or if any point any of those criteria are outside the windows that we've established, you have one choice, which is to say unstable, doing a go around. And we really are trying to keep it simple because it's really difficult for pilots to diagnose the quality of an approach on the last mile or 2 to the runway as they start to become task saturated. So we encourage them to think about it in these broad strokes.
Excellent, excellent. Charlie, I'm sure with your NASA and military experience, you've probably seen your fair share of unstable approaches. Can you talk about your experience?
Be delighted to. Yeah, one of the things that we used to do a lot of when I first started flying in military jets was the precision approach radar approach, PAR. And what was interesting about those was that a controller, you'd be under the hood with an instructor and or practicing training with a buddy instructor, and the controller would be talking you down to 100-foot decision height. And where they dropped you off sometimes when you hit the decision height, sometimes it was right on the runway, sometimes it was not. And so we got ingrained after doing hundreds of those in understanding what was considered a continue to touchdown version of an approach and what wasn't. So what I'd like to do is just share a couple of charts to illuminate that point a little more, because it gets to an issue that we're having using the stabilized approach criteria that Neil talked about. Is why is it that we don't go around as much as we should? And I'll show you some data that amplifies that we're not very good at going around. We are very good at believing we can save an approach, and most of the time we do. But when we don't, it can have dire consequences. So here's a typical view of breaking out at about 100 feet, and everything looks good. Our velocity vector or flight path marker, the military used to call them velocity vectors. It essentially is where's the airplane going, and it's telling us that it's right now on a trajectory to land in the touchdown zone, which is what we're looking for. The glide path angle looks pretty good. We don't have insight into the airspeed, but on this one, everything looks pretty good. But on some of those PARs, we get dumped off with a picture like this when we pull the hood. Now, is this a landable approach or not? Do you have enough information to answer that question? A lot depends on the performance capabilities of the airplane. Is it a small piston? Is it a fast jet? Is it a T-38 at 130 at this point, or is it a Cessna 172 at 90 knots? And so you may not be able to answer the question, but this is not a thing you want to be looking at this late in the approach. And this one probably isn't either. I mean, we're not that far off. We're right sitting on the right edge of the stripe of the runway. Our velocity vector is telling us we're trending off the runway, but our aim point's in the touchdown zone. But how about the steep angle? Not a good place to be. So when is it okay to say I'm going to continue, and when isn't it? We've got through the stabilized approach gates, and yet a lot can happen between 500 and the threshold that requires, at this point, a lot of judgment. There's the requirements that Neil went through here, and the ability to say I'm stable and continuing or unstable going around. And what we're finding, though, is the Flight Safety Foundation came up with those criteria over a decade ago. But in 2017, they issued a report that was based on a finding that said, approach and landing is accounting for 65% of our accidents.
And it turns out that 83% of those could have been avoided with a go-around, because only 3% of unstable approaches result in go-arounds. So why don't pilots go around when they're outside of that criteria? And so Flight Safety Foundation and the Presage group studied the question, and you can get access to the report. It's worth the read. It's detailed and it's lengthy, but it's worth the read on this particular issue. And I left the link there for you to get access to it. The reason they found is because pilots don't see the current go-around policy criteria as realistic for the operational environment. For example, who would go around at 500 feet if they're 2 or 3 knots slow or 2 or 3 knots fast, when they know from 500 feet to the surface they can easily recover that airspeed error? This is where it gets really difficult, because trying to define criteria that are so black and white that they will always work for everyone is very, very difficult. It depends on the aircraft, the pilot's experience, the conditions, the weather, the runway size, length, and width, and so forth. And so it's apparent, according to the report, that revisions are required to the recommended elements of the stabilized approach. And their analysis indicates that some of the guidance is not optimal, because it could encourage go-arounds for approaches that may be of very low risk, like the ones I just alluded to, the 1 or 2 knots either side of the band with time to correct, right? So pilots ignore it because they say, I got this. Well, they got it until they don't. And so where is that line? So in the 2017 report, they tried to come out with some proposed industry validation new guidelines. And what they've added is, I'll just kind of go through some of the changes. They've added some more detail to the types of approaches. Instead of just saying less than a dot deviation, they've added RNAVs, localizers, and visuals with new criteria regarding the profile. They also said energy needs to be VREF plus 10 to VREF without wind adjustment. So there was never any tightening of the speed as you got closer to the runway in the original criteria. And these are all just proposed. They're out for industry evaluation. And something we all should be evaluating. And the other thing they did was they tried to separate the stabilized approach criteria and make it distinct from I must go around kind of criteria. They did that by adding a third gate at 300. It's a proposed gate with the speed limits being narrowed to VREF to VREF plus 10. And prior to that, the 500 and 1,000 foot gates are no longer considered mandatory must go around, but you should be fully stable by 500, and then at 300, if unstable, without hesitation, go around. So there again, this is again all just proposed and out for evaluation in industry. And they've made one more new focus, which is emphasis on the landing zone, the threshold and landing zone parameters, and what to do relative to safe guidelines as you get closer to the runway. Looking for 50 feet, the VREF plus 10 max, and then focusing on the touchdown zone, circled there, number 5, to make sure there's awareness of the aim point being there. Back to my earlier pictures with the flight path markers, is the aim point in the touchdown zone. And finally, one that I'll poke at a little bit is touchdown on the center line with the main gear straddling the center line. If all main landing gear are on one side of the center line, go around. I beg to differ with that one, and I think this is all part of the fact this is out for validation. In the military, we used to intentionally land on staggered opposite sides of the center line of the runway in formation work. But also, to me, what's missing in this statement, it's a good guideline. You want to be on the center line. But what's missing is where is the flight path marker? If you're not within this criteria on a 150-foot wide runway and your landing gear is only 15 feet between the wheels, but you're off to the left or the right, should you be going around if in fact your flight path marker velocity vector is trending back to the center line and not headed off the runway? Is that a good reason to be going around? So these are all out for evaluation. And I'll just refer you to a shuttle landing. My third flight in the space shuttle was very much this kind of case. We were coming into Kennedy, runway 33 that you see in the upper left picture. This is at 300 feet. I'm sorry, 300 knots at 500 feet on the radar altimeter. And you can see the velocity vector at the bottom. I'm in the pre-flare, pulling the nose up along the center line, pretty much on the center line of the runway. The plus sign up towards the runway is actually where the nose is pointed. So it's crabbed quite a bit into the wind. The top right picture is a photographer well off to the side of the runway. You can see I'm basically pointed at that photographer while the runway is going off to the right side of the picture. And then you can see in the actual touchdown at 100, I'm at actually slightly after touchdown, 170 knots ground speed. I'm off to the left of the runway because we got a big gust of wind at about 10 feet in the air that moved us to the left, and I could not completely counter it. But the velocity vector was in fact headed towards the center of the runway. And you can see just before touchdown, the lower right picture, 22 feet between the main gear. The right main is going to touch first, the left main is up higher, and the right main is going to touch down basically right on the center line. Of course, I had no option to go around in this case, but I did have the velocity vector under control. I had it going where it needed to be, and it was correcting. So I share this with you because this is the crux of our issue with a lot of landing accidents. Some airplanes tend to land, be at high energy when they land and they run off the ends of the runways. Others have directional control handling qualities issues. I know the PA-46s have had a lot of accidents that go off the side of the runways. Whatever it may be, there's a lot to be said about how you're managing your flight path and your velocity vector as you come into the landing area. And the emphasis on those touchdown points is really important here. You should know what these mean to you, and where you are in the landing zone, and whether you're floating too long and shouldn't be thinking about taking it around. And consider these in your own flying as you determine for yourself what is too much and I'm taking it around without hesitation. In this case, you can see what the markers mean in terms of distance from the threshold on an instrument approach, precision approach runway. Take a look at this advisory circular and you get your ideas of what to use for references. If it's a visual runway, the 5th centerline stripe is about 1,000 feet down, just for example.
You know, I guess with the exception of the space shuttle, we almost always have the option of going around. Yet, I think for a lot of pilots, the aspect of going around is viewed as a failure, unless we choose to do it cognitively. If we're going around because we're too fast or too high or not on center line, we've made a mistake. We've made a failure. And yet, when we shot the video, I guess almost everybody who watched that video probably thought to themselves, there's no way I would do this. Look how fast this guy is, totally unstable. I would never do this. Yet people have done that. So how do we change the psychology or the thought process about the fact, the idea of going around is a good command use of your command authority and your decision-making skills? And any comments about that? Neil?
Yeah, David, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is we have to change the psychology of it. And we have to, as pilots, be proud of a go-around and maybe even have a little swagger behind a go-around. And I'll just relate a quick story. About 15 years ago, as a new full-time CFI on my new career, I was hired to manage and instruct owner pilot in his brand new SR-22. This would have been 2004, 2005, when Cirrus was really taking off. And he lived down on one of the islands in Massachusetts. And so my very first trip with him and his wife on board, I flew down, picked them up on the island, and they were coming up to a really small 2,500, 2,700 foot, I don't remember exactly, foot strip outside of Boston to go have a business meeting. My first approach with them both in the airplane, and based on the reported winds at this untowered airport, I picked the same runway everyone else was using, entered the pattern, and got down to about 50 feet and just realized I was smoking across the ground, and it just didn't feel good. And so I did a go-around and looked at the windsock and said, you know, the reported winds were 180 degrees opposite. They were changing so fast. Howard Airport, I picked the same runway everyone else was using, entered the pattern, and got down to about 50 feet and just realized I was smoking across the ground, and it just didn't feel good. And so I did a go-around and looked at the windsock and said, you know, the reported winds were 180 degrees opposite. They were changing so fast that I was actually trying to land on this short runway with the tailwind unbeknownst to me. So again, it's just a matter of having that confidence and not feeling like you did something wrong, but just feeling like this isn't good, and the swagger right? The kind of confidence to say, I don't like this, I'm going to take it around. And then afterwards, just explain to them on the ground, you know, there was an erroneous wind report, situation didn't look good, every landing is optional, and we're going to work at it until it feels good and is the correct approach. So I think the biggest thing is really a change in psychology.
Charlie?
Yeah, I think that's right. When you look at the statistics in these studies that show that only 3% of the approaches that should go around actually execute a go around, it tells you that pilots are not buying in. And it's probably because they're correcting situations as a routine. They have, you know, they got too tight a turn into the final approach fix, they're still fast, they get it corrected and it works. And it's kind of like a normalization of deviance. They have a deviation from what they are trying to achieve, but they fix it. And that's good until it's not. And so that's why I focused a little bit there a minute ago on the judgment calls that have to come into play, that writing some criteria out are not necessarily the answer, but having in your mindset that I'm not going to be ashamed to go around, I'm going to make the right decision and go around if I'm in doubt. And thinking through what the velocity vector is telling you, where your flight path marker is, your ability to manage where the flight path marker is on the runway or not manage it when you get tighter and tighter. It's so much easier to take it around, come back around, be more stable and under control. So it's a mindset change that all of us as pilots need to be getting into. Because other than, you know, when we were on our first solo and the instructor stepped out of the airplane and we did the pattern by the numbers like he said to, and on one of them, he's on his little walkie-talkie on the ground saying, take this one around. Many of us probably haven't ever had to go around since then. And so it's in our mindset that we're going to fix this until we can't, and then we regret it.
David, I would add one more point too, which is that I think it's really important for pilots to remember in a single pilot environment how hard it is to be both the aircraft pilot and the aircraft commander at the same time. And you're in a situation now where your brain is really focused on piloting the airplane. You may realize in a corner of your mind that you're a little high and a little fast. And what I've seen over and over in thousands of hours of instructing and check rides is that pilots become fixated on making the sight picture look good. And they'll force the airplane down to cross the runway at about a 50-foot threshold, which is about what David did in the video. But they're so focused on that the commander part of their brain has gone off duty, and they don't realize that their height might be okay, but they're now at 50 knots over their intended landing speed. And there's just no way the aircraft can stop with that kind of kinetic energy on touchdown. So I would encourage pilots to remember that, and remember that as you get inside 500 feet, your ability to self-monitor is going to decrease. And that's one of the reasons we really encourage people to shift that decision-making back a little bit so that you can catch yourself before you get in that tunnel vision.
Excellent point.
That's a great point, Neil. And you just reminded me that we as single pilots need to educate and communicate to our passengers. A lot of times they are our family, that a go-around sometimes occurs. We do them so infrequently that we're kind of, if we do one, we're kind of expecting that our passengers are now freaked out, quote unquote, about this. Are we going to crash? Or it may be a totally normal event for us, but now we're dealing mentally with what are they going through, and how do I, even at the wrong time and trying to communicate that to them. So if we have that conversation with them months in advance about, hey, if this ever happens, just it's normal and it's part of our routine that we have to do. I think that's important for our passengers to understand that too. So Charlie, you're kind of the leader in our CJP group at compiling data on go-arounds and how they affect not only safety, but insurance premiums. Can you elaborate on some of the work you've done?
Sure, I'd like to. You know, a lot of what we do to continually self-monitor, as Neil was alluding to, depends on our ability to debrief and to build an improvement plan into our ongoing flying as we strive to get better. And so the airlines have taken advantage of flight data monitoring for years. And so I've got a couple of charts to share with you here to show what we're able to do now in the the world of general aviation, where flight data monitoring may be actually becoming more affordable and beneficial to those of us in general aviation. So this is a chart that shows a debrief of a flight I made, and my belief is if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So the trick has been that we have not been able to afford flight data monitoring in general aviation airplanes because of the complexity of the system that would deliver that. That's changing, and it's changing because our ability to manage big data is becoming all the more less expensive. So in my airplane, in the Citation CJ1 Plus that I fly, I've added through an AirSync device the ability to transmit data that is recorded in my avionics to an analyst on the ground. And literally by the time I shut the airplane down, I can see a number of scoring parameters about my stabilized approach that I just flew. And I was doing a bunch of practice approaches, as you see in the upper left corner there. And then all of those things we've been talking about on the stabilized approach criteria with the goals and the actuals are scored, and then I can go back and self-assess. And the way I do that is I go to an app on my phone that's shown in the middle pictures there. I click on the flight of interest, and then I, in this case, debrief with Cloud Ahoy, and it takes me to the image that's in the upper center where I get the details. And this data could be used for a number of things. It could be used in type clubs to analyze how does everybody do on certain maneuvers and what is the standard and how does an individual do against that standard. It can be used for improving insurance premiums for aircraft in certain categories that are of a type, or all of us in GA for that matter. Insurance is becoming quite an issue. The point is that this is becoming more affordable, more available, and more accurate, and is something that we all ought to think about implementing more broadly to benefit all of safety, in particular in these areas that continue to be our nemesis, like runway overruns and not being stable on approach. This kind of system is ideal for being able to debrief yourself on, was I stable to the extent I thought I was?
Charlie, that's great information. And I know I read recently that insurance companies are now even developing insurance premiums based on, as you say, FOQA data that's acquired on the airplane in flight. And the insurance companies are using that data to insure and develop premiums for their individual renters of single engine airplanes. So guys, that's been fantastic information. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us. There's lots more great safety information available from the NBAA website. You can also anytime go to the CJP website, citationjetpilots.com, and click on the safety tab and get all sorts of free information available to anyone. Thanks so much for helping, guys, and thanks for watching.
Thanks, David.